All right, this one, I've been told that my mic audio is really quiet, and I'm pretty sure, right, that my levels are okay. But I'll just move my mic a bit closer because people have said that my levels on YouTube are a bit low. So this one's about parenting. This is for all the dads living with schizophrenia. Um, and I'm going to take you through the first 6 years, right? So my first 6 years as a dad living with schizophrenia. I can't give any advice to mums because I'm not a woman. I've not carried and birthed a child, and I've not had to worry about medication and pregnancy and all of that stuff. So I can't give any advice to mothers with schizophrenia. But I'll tell you what it's been like as a dad, and as a stay-at-home dad, right? So I was doing my PhD before my daughter was born and before she was made, right? So I started my PhD a few years before we found out that we were expecting. And then, obviously my ex-partner had maternity leave, so she was off for the first year. And then she went back to work, and because I was already at home doing my PhD and doing a bit of freelancing and a bit of remote work, it made sense for me to take on the sort of childcare. So for the first 4 years of my daughter's life, I was home with her, and it was COVID. So we had a number of things working against us, really. Like, we couldn't really go to too many places. I couldn't take her to soft play areas. It was very home-based, right? And we were really lucky to be living in a really rural location at that time. So, there were lovely walks, like just around the corner. There was a beautiful wooded area called Holden Forest, which was, 10-minute drive away. So that's what I did, really, when she was a baby. I took her for these long walks through the woods in a baby carrier. And she would fall asleep about an hour into the walk, and then, she'd wake up in the afternoon. But in terms of like my symptoms, I actually found just me and a baby was one of the best things for my mental health ever. It's probably the time in my life where I've been the most stable. Even though she was crying pretty much all day, and to cope with the stress of a crying baby expressing a need that I couldn't meet because I couldn't breastfeed her, which is what she wanted. I ate a lot of pizza to deal with the stress and gained a lot of weight. And lots of people in my social network were quite happy to tell me that is what had happened. Which was a bit of a vicious cycle, because when the people around you continually tell you that you're getting fat, that makes you want to eat more. So, but in terms of like the stress diathesis model, I was under an enormous amount of stress. It was COVID, I had a baby to look after, and I wasn't really particularly well resourced, It was COVID. We didn't have a lot of money, all kinds of other things. Stay-at-home dads get a lot of shit from onlookers, Lots of people like to tell you, they like to give you unsolicited advice when you're out with your baby and that sort of thing. So there were loads of stresses. But I didn't really become symptomatic. It was really interesting. And I think part of that is to do with babies don't represent the same threat potential as adults, right? Adults, have things like sarcasm in their repertoire of communicative behaviors, passive aggression, all of that stuff. Infants don't know about any of that stuff. So when an infant talks to you, or a toddler talks to you, or a young child, preschooler, talks to you, it's very direct, it's very face value, and the kinds of questions that young children ask are actually a pleasure to answer, right? So I found that really interesting from a psychosis, schizophrenia, linguistics standpoint. I was like, isn't it interesting that I have no paranoia about my child? I'm not reading into anything she says as though, well, what do you mean by that? What are you getting at? What are you trying to say? None of that. It's just this pure little innocent, no bullshit communicator. She just says what's on her mind, and it's always beautiful. So that was lovely. So early years, stay-at-home dad, brilliant. From a symptom point of view, so even though I was under huge amounts of stress, I never focused on my daughter as a potential source of distress for me. Like she never gave any signs or signals that I needed to overinterpret or work hard to understand what she was getting at, which was a lovely break from my entire life, essentially. So that was nice. And there's something in there in terms of research, like, and it calls back to my previous video about how some people you bump into, they kind of feel safe, So there's something in that for researchers to explore, like, what is it that makes these people feel safe? What is it about their demeanor, their linguistics, their paralinguistics, that makes them come across to people like me as non-threatening? That's something that we should really try and bottle and distribute so that we can teach those skills to relatives and carers and healthcare professionals. These are the behaviors that don't trigger paranoia. Maybe do some more of those. And I've been really fortunate that my daughter, that initial imprinting and the bonding that we've shared has carried over. So now, even though she's become a much more sophisticated communicator, I still don't hear what she says in a persecutory or paranoid way. We have a relationship that is very direct, and there's no malice behind what she says. I don't see anything she says as potentially carrying hurtful or manipulative meaning or anything like that. So she's great for my mental health. Obviously, I'm not speaking for everybody with psychosis and schizophrenia. I know of plenty of cases where people have become unwell and they've actually fixated on their children as the sort of delusional object, like my child is Satan, or my child's possessed, or so I'm not saying that my experience generalizes to everybody, but my personal experience has been that my daughter is the safest person in my life. She is the least complicated communicator. I don't read into what she says. We have a wonderful relationship that is essentially completely outside of my illness. And that's made it quite easy for me to be a good enough parent. I wouldn't say I'm a good parent, but I'm a good enough parent, And I'm moderately psychologically informed, so I try and do things that are healthy for her and good for her development. I try and instill the right kinds of messages. When we're playing a video game and she messes up, it's like, don't worry, mistakes are good, mistakes are okay. That's how we learn. We just keep trying until we get it right. That sort of thing. But there have been times over the last couple of years where I've really struggled with my symptoms. I've really struggled with my living situation. Obviously, my ex-partner and I separated, and I moved, and that's a big transition. When I started this channel, I was in the midst of that transition. I was in quite a deep depression when I started making these videos, and I was live streaming to sort of fill my time, because I had to give up my job because I couldn't cope with it. And while I was being treated for depression, it wasn't sensible for me to go back to work, so I started playing Fortnite, and that's where the first 1,000 subs on this channel came from. And that was obviously challenging as a parent, being an hour away from my daughter, having to jump in the car 2 or 3 times a week to pick her up from school and all that kind of stuff. But we got through it, So in terms of sort of parenting with psychotic symptoms, I've found that I've managed it. It's not been easy. PhD, COVID, separation, difficulty with living situations, all kinds of shit. Being a stay-at-home dad, enormous pressures. Even a relapse, that's another really interesting thing. When I had a relapse, and I was properly slipping into a very acute psychosis, I was in floods of tears. I just gave she was 3 at the time, I just gave her a big hug, got in the car, went to the hospital, told them everything I thought was going on, got sectioned, got out, carried on. So my daughter is an enormous protective factor for me. And the fact that our relationship is not marked by my symptomatology is a blessing. So if there are any kind of expectant fathers watching who have schizophrenia, please take some comfort in knowing that for some people, not everybody, but for some people, it's possible that becoming a parent can actually be very psychologically protective and very therapeutic. So that's been my experience.